starting a new series.
New series.
This is the Tim and Jim talk about whatever they're reading series.
My favorite kind of series.
Okay.
My favorite kind of conversation with friends.
So I'm going to start this one off. I got given this book by a friend. It's by John C. Lennox. He's a mathematician at Oxford.
Yeah, he's a really famous Christian mathematician who's done a lot of apologetic stuff, arguing with atheists for Christian faith and revelation from the lens of math and science.
So this is his book on Revelation. It's called God, AI, and the End of History. So I have just started reading this book. I don't exactly know what his eschatological position is, so I'm not saying I agree with everything so far that's in this book. I've just read the introduction, which the introduction alone is like 100 pages. So.
You can't, I haven't read it, but you can't tell from the title, but it's actually some kind of commentary on the book of Revelation.
Yeah, exactly. Mostly a commentary on, I thought it was going to be more of a commentary on AI, and it may get into that, but it's first and foremost about Revelation. So he brings up in the first, and just in the introduction, he brings up, there is a neuroscientist named Ian, I-A-I-N.
I think just Ian.
Ian, okay, that's the British way of spelling it. Ian
McGilchrist.
Ian McGilchrist. He has a book called The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, which was published in 2021. He says, he argues that we have been dominated by our left hemisphere, our brain, with the result that we have been persuaded that the materialistic, mechanistic, reductionist, scientific, manipulative approach gives us the whole picture of reality, whereas it has blinded us to the integrative, holistic, and more intelligent, meaning-yielding perspective of the right hemisphere. So I think to summarize that, he's talking about how in the West, essentially since the Enlightenment, there's just been this push towards more analytical, kind of left-brained thinking, and maybe even when it comes to religion, systematic theology, maybe something that as Reformed Protestant Presbyterians, we would be kind of in line with the frozen chosen, and setting this up kind of against maybe parts of Christendom that are more into the mystical or the historical. So what are your thoughts on this dichotomy that he's setting up here, Tim?
Interesting as a framework for thinking about things, but I'm always a little skeptical of things being kind of either or. You're either this or you're that. Again, I'm no psychologist, I'm no neuroscientist, of course, but even the whole like, oh, your right side of your brain does this and the left side of your brain does this, I'm sure there's a lot of truth to that. I'm sure there's experiments where, somehow someone gets injured on one side of their brain and everything totally changes in the way they approach the world. But I always kind of want to think biblically about the world and theologically and scripturally. I want to lean more on the side of the mind being one and the soul being one, rather than there being, even if this is not intentional, ending up thinking like there's kind of two me's or there's two halves of me. No, there's one me, and I may tend to one side rather than the other by disposition, by nature, by personality, or by training, by nurture around me, by sinfulness, by suppressing certain things. But I don't think these two things are really ever that far away from each other. The Enlightenment was certainly not the first time that people became really fixated on the mind or rationality. You have the famous kind of divide between the Epicureans and the Stoics in the ancient Roman world. The Apostle Paul speaking to both. Even with the Enlightenment, pretty quickly after the Enlightenment, you have reactions against it with the Romantic movement of people saying, no, nature is divine, or let's focus more on the emotional life or on expressiveness. And so, I think maybe we have really hardcore emphasized kind of the rational side of things in the Western world, and that's probably true in the modern world. Arguably, this is a problem that goes back even farther into the Middle Ages. A lot of people like to blame Duns Scotus, this medieval theologian, about 1000 AD, for taking the side of this big debate about what makes things real. Is there a reality behind the names that we give things, or do the names themselves give them reality? And he argued the names make things real. And so a lot of people say, well, this is kind of the beginning of this hyper rationalistic separation between what we say and what's actually real. And so I don't know. I'm a little sometimes hesitant to make this split between things really hard, but generally speaking, yeah, I think he is probably right that the modern Western, especially the modern secular Western world, has run itself into a total dead end trying to explain everything materialistically. I mean, this is the dominant worldview behind many of our institutions, most of the scientific endeavor, although interestingly, this is not how science started. Science did not start in the modern world as a purely rational, materialistic, there's no outside spiritual realm. That's not how it started, but that's what it became. Evolution, of course, Darwin's theory of evolution was in many ways, he wasn't the first person to think of evolution or to theorize things changing over long periods of time. He was trying to find a way to explain the world apart from God creating it. And so, yeah, this is a big problem in our world. But at the same time, I will say, and some of my theologians I like a lot, like Herman Bavinck, this Dutch theologian I often talk about, he makes a really good point that humans were made for the spiritual realm. They were made for the emotional life as well as the intellectual life. And so when people go pedal to the metal on one side of those, they never can really escape the other side of it, but it often comes out in very strange, kind of destructive ways. And so he talks about, he's writing in the early 1900s, people fixated on kind of science and rationalism and materialism. Alongside of that, also, a big rise in the Western world of interest in the occult, seances, various forms of interest in Eastern religion, kind of pagan irrationalism. And, that has obviously only accelerated in the last 100 years, alongside of this huge push to make everything explainable just by material causes. So the human desire for the transcendent and for the spiritual always comes out. And when you try to pretend that it's not there or that it doesn't matter, it will, I think, tend to come out in much worse ways, in much darker ways. And we should be warned. And our society is not in a good place insofar as people are looking to paganism, the occult, witchcraft, all these things. Christians should say, not, oh, who cares? None of that's real. Christians should say that is real. It's very powerful and it's very destructive, and don't touch it with a 100-foot pole.
I totally agree that as humans, you can't really make little nice clean lines in our intellect or our personality or our emotions. But it does appeal to me, the idea of leaning into certain aspects of who you are. I feel like I've done that myself, and it's rewarded me well in business. A lot of Bitcoiners are INTJs, famous Myers-Briggs PSYOP. I am an INTJ, although I think it may be becoming an ENTJ. It's heresy to say, but I'm an INTJ. A lot of Bitcoiners pride themselves on being INTJs. I think it's like 3% of the population, but something crazy like 90% of Bitcoin OGs are, not that I'm an OG,
just
but...
For those who are not up to speed on the Myers-Briggs PSYOP, explain briefly what INTJ means.
Myers-Briggs, instead of just saying right-brained or left-brained, it has 4 distinctions. You can be introvert or extrovert. You can be intuitive or feeling, so N or F. You can be thinking or perceiving, so T or P. And then you can be judging or what's the opposite of judging? Maybe that was the feeling one. I can't remember what the 4th category was, but basically what happens is, since it's 2 to the 4, there's 16 different personality types, right? Because you can be one or the other. There's not really a possibility for you to be, I'm 60% E and 40% I, although that is really what it boils down to. If you take one of these tests and you look under the covers of it, you can kind of see, you scored 70% on E versus I. And so even it admits that it's like a rough approximation, because it's like, well, yeah, you're still 30% E, right? So you can still operate. The point, though, is a lot of Bitcoiners kind of pride themselves on being a part of this INTJ group.
We're very analytical.
Yeah, you're rational. Very analytical, rational, left-brained, kind of.
We're not swayed by emotions, and we don't go along with the crowd.
Yeah. And even Bitcoin itself has been heralded as like an IQ test for this, right? And so they're like, patting themselves on the back because like INTJs are the smartest people that are out there from an analytical and rational standpoint. And Bitcoin is like this ultimate arbiter of truth. and it's like the ultimate expression of, enlightenment and scientific rationalism. Like we finally discovered Bitcoin, and it's like, it kind of sets itself up almost, in my opinion, like an antichrist, right? Because like Christ, the logos, the word being like the truth, externally delivered through divine inspiration, versus Bitcoin being discovered. And it's like, oh, it's this bedrock thing that never changes, and we can always point to it. It doesn't matter what anybody says, it's like true.
Right.
So there's a part of me that just, the hair stands up on my arms when I see people setting it up in that kind of, it's competing, right? There can really only be one truth. And I'm not saying that Bitcoin isn't close to truth, but it's still a human thing and it exists in the human world. It is not the creator. Right.
Well, and it doesn't mean that there aren't real differences between people or cultures or, historical periods in terms of what people saw or didn't see or what they emphasized or what they were good at or what they're not. In a lot of ways, this is what Scripture talks about when it says in the body of Christ, the church is made up of many members, and they all play a role, and they're all important. Not everyone is going to be the one up front speaking. Not everyone's going to be the one caring for the poor. And so, there is a diversity, to use an overused word in our society. There is a diversity of dispositions and gifts and abilities and opportunities. And it's like, that has a role. And we're glad that there's some really analytical people out there. And it's obvious these are the early adopters of Bitcoin. These people are very drawn to Bitcoin for a lot of reasons. But at the same time, part of why we're talking about this is because there's a lot more to life than the rational or the analytic. And that doesn't mean things like religion or Christianity or faith are irrational or illogical, but they are mysterious, and they are a different kind of knowledge than this, say, mathematical knowledge. Bavinck makes this point when he's talking about faith not just being some irrational kind of leap into the dark or some kind of just emotional crutch that some people just need. He says, no, faith is knowledge, even if it's not the same kind of knowledge as mathematical knowledge. He said mathematical knowledge is compulsive. You have to agree with a mathematical proof. It's internally demonstrative. He says faith is not the same. God has not constituted us or faith so that it's something that you must agree with. There is a sense in which, faith is believing and hoping in what you don't see, but it is knowing. It really is knowing. A Christian does know God by faith, does know that Christ has risen from the dead by faith, and that's not irrational, and it's not just an emotional crutch. So, anyways, I think it's a plea with our friends in the Bitcoin world to be more open to the emotional and the spiritual and the religious. But also, too, there's a lot of people who maybe look from that side of things at Bitcoiners who are hyper-rational, hyper-analytical, and they are turned off by it because they tend to be know-it-alls, or they tend to be very reductionistic about what the world is about and what life is about. And, maybe is this true, too, of people getting interested in sound money? You turn everything into a factor of money can fix everything, and everything's about money, and everything's about solving economic problems. I think that's probably an issue.
I would just encourage Bitcoiners to not completely discount the emotional and the humanities. I can't even believe I'm saying this.
Let the record show.
Let the record show. Mr. STEM
is promoting emotions.
But people are just wonderfully complex, beautiful image bearers of God.
Right. And I was explaining this to one of my sons the other day about women tend to be more emotional than men, and that's part of what makes it so wonderful to find a good wife, is the complement that she is to the husband in his tendency. Again, not always. There's always exceptions, of course, but men tend to be more analytical and more even-keeled emotionally, for good and for bad, and women, for good and for bad, tend to be less even-keeled emotionally, higher highs and lower lows. They feel things more acutely. They read people's emotions and their states much better than men tend to do. They're more interested in it than men tend to be. But that's a great thing. I mean, when I was in seminary, I was reading a book about knowledge and kind of the theology of knowledge. How do you know things? What do we know? How do we know? It's called epistemology philosophically. And he had a whole section in there talking about kind of the biblical epistemology of emotions. And it was totally eye-opening for me because I have tended, I don't think quite as much as you, but I've tended to be very much on the rational side of things and the analytical and the logical and kind of the hard science side of things. And I've been usually pretty suspicious of emotions as like, I don't know, it's unreliable, not interesting, doesn't matter. But reading this whole couple of chapters on the epistemology of emotions, and he's saying, no, look, emotions are a way, not the way, but they are a way of knowing the world that God has made us with, and that they're not something to run away from. The Bible is full of profoundly emotional language and prayers and expressions and descriptions of God and who he is. Obviously, God doesn't have emotions like we do, but God has affections, we might say, is the right theological way to talk about it. God is not overwhelmed by his by the world or by what's happening in it the way we are emotionally oftentimes, but God moves towards things in love or in joy or in hatred, in a sense. And we, as his image bearers, are to reflect that, even though often, of course, our emotions go sideways sinfully. But that's also true of our reason and our rationality, which is kind of another big aha when you understand that in the Western world, we tend to think, rationality is kind of the island you can stand on by which to understand everything and evaluate everything. And this is taught in our school system, from a very early age, that you have facts and then you have values. And facts are the things that really matter. And values, religion, faith, emotions, maybe not. But that's actually not true biblically. We are, in our terms, in our kind of theological side of things, Presbyterianism, we call this being totally depraved. That doesn't mean you're as bad as you could be in every aspect, but it means you are entirely depraved. Your whole being is marred by sin, including your mind and your rationality. You and I have talked about how reason and rationality can be ways of running away from God and avoiding God, even while being internally consistent in a way with themselves. And so that's another thing we'd want to say to our Bitcoin friends is don't build your life on reason. You're meant to build your life on the one who gave you reason, on the God of Logos, the God of reason, the God of reality, the God of being.
I feel like men and women can weaponize both of these things, right? Women can weaponize their emotions and use them to manipulate or try to get back at their husband. And men can weaponize rationality and win every single argument and have absolutely no sympathy whatsoever for their wife.
Right, yeah. All these things, when kind of overly leaned upon, even if it's who I am, this is just my personality. I'm just a hardcore, hot-blooded Italian American. I can't help it.
Yeah.
Even so, it's like, okay, well, that's still not okay.
Or what I said was the truth.
Right.
What's the big deal? You can't handle the truth.
I won the argument. I got to the end, and I proved you wrong.
But it's like we should be encouraging one another. Like women should be drawing their husbands out and helping them to be more fully human in their emotions and to be okay with that. Not that we have to be like some soy boy that's crying all the time. But
right, yeah, and that's part of the dynamic too, and maybe this is part of what we're saying to Bitcoiners and non-Bitcoiners, is learning to accept that other people are different than you are. And in a marriage, that's also true. That, even though you bring something to the table and you're trying to help the other person, that this is also who God's made them to be. Yeah. And they have a way, it's like Paul's thing about the church. There's many members in the body. This is just how it is, and there's many things about ourselves, for good and for bad, that in a sense are inescapable. You can't just decide one day, I'm going to be a totally different person. I'm going to have a completely different way of approaching the world. You are handed many, many, many things just by nature of the fact that you were born in the time and in the family that you were born into. And that's just what it is. And that's okay. We look forward to the new creation of meeting lots of other believers from all different periods of history. And I think we'll just be amazed at the different ways they approach things. Even I think you and I have talked about this a little bit, the entire kind of framework of what is your IQ or what is your personality type. I suspect that is a very modern Western way of thinking about ourselves. Even the fact that you would ask that question about yourself or other people betrays all kinds of things about what you think it means to be a person. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't do that. It doesn't mean that's not important or not helpful in our world. But I suspect that most people in most of history would have been like, what are you talking about? So yeah, there's a lot more out there than kind of what to me feels right now like rationality or science or whatever. And it's helpful to hear things like John Lennox pointing that out. And part of what he's saying, explain why he's saying this at the beginning of a commentary on Revelation.
Well, here, I'll read it. He goes on to say, he adduces, I'd never heard that word, adduces.
It's a good word.
Evidence to show that the right cerebral hemisphere makes the main contribution not only to emotional and social intelligence, but also to ordinary intelligence or cognitive power, that is, to apprehension and not only to comprehension. The main force of his work is that there really is something more. We must, in his view, at least make space for God and the sacred. The book of Revelation will fill that space. So he's teeing up his commentary on Revelation, but at the end of the day, we're making space for God and the sacred.
Right. And I think, you could say the entire thing about all of Christian revelation, that God speaking into our world, the fact that God can do that, that is ruled out in modern kind of Western materialism. They would say, whether there is a God or not, we don't know, but it's not even possible. We're just not even going to operate like that's possible, that God could speak into this world or that God could intervene in it. That is, by definition, unscientific. And so you just can't ever talk about it. This is why the intelligent design guys, cannot hardly get anywhere, because you start out by defining science as only materialistic explanations. Therefore, of course, what do you expect? Someone who comes along and says, hey, it looks like the universe was designed by a designer, they're going to write that off immediately. And so all of Revelation, all of Scripture is part of this aspect of the spiritual world invading the material world or intersecting with it, depending on how you want to think about it. But the book of Revelation in particular is doing this because of the kind of literature that it is there at the end of the New Testament. And it's not a new kind of literature. It's scattered throughout the Bible. The Old Testament has a few examples of it. Other parts of the New Testament kind of play with this style of writing. But the idea of Revelation, or literally the apocalypse, that's what they used to call the book. It comes from the Greek word apocalypsis. It has to do with something being revealed, something being literally unhidden, unveiled, something that used to be kind of underneath a shroud, and now you see what it is. This is what the book of Revelation is from the get-go. Is you have the Apostle John in prison on the island of Patmos, and he looks up on a Sunday morning there having church by himself because he's on his own on the island, and he gets a vision into heaven, and God says, come up here. And he gets a heavenly vision of reality. And it's not that, and I don't know exactly where he's going to go with the book, but one of the amazing things about the book of Revelation, I think, is that what you are seeing in the book of Revelation, like in the rest of the Bible, is not that heaven is a completely separate realm. You kind of graduate from this realm into something that's bigger and better and beyond this realm. But that heaven is, you could think of it as the headquarters of the universe, where the world is run from, so to speak. And what happens in heaven first follows in the rest of creation. Heaven is part of God's creation. There are lots of angels there and everything. But this kind of unveiling of the proper reality in the world, or the ultimate reality.
He does go into that later. He talks about the tabernacle and Moses sort of getting shown the heavens and being like, pattern the tabernacle after this. It's a type and a shadow, right?
Right.
So heaven's leading, Moses is following the tabernacle. There's another piece that you said in there about sort of the physical realm and then the spiritual realm, and then whether or not it's coming down or invading it.
Right.
I can't remember if it's in this book or one of the other books I've been reading that we can talk about, but this will be a good subject for the next talk, because I think the idea is that the ancients, or people in distant history, didn't really view it that way. It was all one and the same. There was no separation between the two.
Right.
And the fact that we're even saying that is another betrayal of our perspective, right? Because we're coming from like the modern hyper-rational perspective. So
right. Well, yeah, let's pick up next time with some more of that, or maybe whatever book I'm reading.
We can do whatever we want.